All right, let's begin with the presentation on homelessness. Manager, did you want to open?
Sure. Mayor, Council, this is a nice segue from the work session we had last time, looking at best practices nationally, and then today we're going to spend some time talking about all the work that we're doing within the city of Austin to address and support people experiencing homelessness. So I'll turn it over to Assistant City Manager Rodney Gonzalez.
Thank you, Spencer. Rodney Gonzalez, Assistant City Manager. With me today is Veronica Briceño. Veronica is the Director for Small and Minority Business Resources. She is currently the Interim Homeless Strategy Officer. Veronica has taken a comprehensive look at all the city's initiatives with regard to homelessness, and in particular, this presentation will cover our current response to the January resolution from Council requesting that we look into an immediate homeless shelter. So with that, I'll turn it over to Veronica.
Good morning, Council. So as Rodney mentioned, I'm here to talk to you a little bit about what we're doing as a city in regards of the homelessness issue, as well as what we can look to do in the future, in the near future and beyond. Before I get started in talking about what we're doing, I did want to give a special acknowledgement. I think you're going to see through this presentation that this is an issue that we as a city have responded to in multiple departments, and I've listed them on the screen. So I wanted to give a special thank you to the departments that are working on this issue each and every day, and you'll see often in many cases they did that out of their own initiative in a very organic way, and I really appreciate their public service, and I know you do as well. I also wanted to give a special thank you to our former interim Assistant City Manager, Sarah Hensley. She really led these efforts for a time period, and she really got us in a good direction with some momentum, and I appreciate that as well. And finally, we have an interim homeless strategy office team. They've really hit the ground running with us, and they've also come from all areas of the city, so I wanted to give a special thank you to them as well for their hard work. So as you can see, we have talked about homelessness as a city for many years, dating back, I'm sure, earlier than 1985, but 1985 was the first plan that we had from the city of Austin on the books. And we charted out some of the plans and some of the things that we have done to address the issue, most recently adopting the Austin's Action Plan to End Homelessness in 2018. Our most recent point in time count, and I know that you have seen these numbers provided to us from ECHO, the Ending Community Homeless Coalition. Our most recent count shows that there was a 5% increase in overall in individuals experiencing homelessness. This is a number of 2,255. Of these, 1,086 were unsheltered. And I would like to note that while that's a 5% increase overall from 2018 to 2019, if you look at the past 5 years, this is a 142% increase of unsheltered individuals experiencing homelessness. During the same time period, the overall population of Austin grew by 12%. And of the population that we're looking at that are experiencing homelessness, the largest population is unaccompanied individuals or single adults. Homelessness, as you know, is a priority for City Council. In fact, it was made the top priority for City Council. Over the past 5 years, Council has approved over 30 resolutions regarding the subject matter, and you see a variety of some of these resolutions on the slide. They include looking at how we manage and operate the arch, panhandling alternatives, public toilets, and so forth. And we also, as a city, have had additional outward-facing changes to highlight. I mentioned the ARCH contract. Based on Council's guidance, we did restructure that contract. We had the endorsement of the action plan that I mentioned before. We're in the process of implementing the Pay for Success program, and we've also created a community brain trust. The city has also changed within. So these are some of the highlights of what we as city departments have done to address the issue, and often just because we saw a need. So for example, the Public Health Department, they're providing rapid rehousing services, and we'll talk a little bit more about that, the need for rapid rehousing as we're addressing the issue of homelessness. The Public Library in this year's budget has included 2 community service coordinators in libraries to help people experiencing homelessness directly. APD and EMS have created the HOST team, or Homeless Outreach Street Team, alongside Integral Care and being an outward-facing part of our city and helping individuals experiencing homelessness. We have the Downtown Austin Community Court. They provide a variety of services, including case management as well. Our Neighborhood Housing and Community Development Department, which provides needed resources in that housing continuum to people that are eligible for services. The Office of Innovation received a Bloomberg grant that you're aware of to address the issue of homelessness, as well as an additional grant from the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation. They also created the Austin Homeless Advisory Council, or AHAC. This council is made up of individuals who have experienced or are experiencing homelessness, and this is a great resource for us as a city to receive input from individuals experiencing homelessness. And our Parks Department is working in partnership with the Other Ones Foundation to look at park cleanups, camp cleanups, and employing individuals who are homeless with day labor opportunities. We've also evolved our services. For example, our Public Works Department has recently contracted with WorkQuest to provide under-the-bridge cleanups at 60-plus highway underpass locations. The Watershed Protection Department has a pilot program that's called Leave No Trace, as well as the Purple Bag program to help with watershed cleanups. And they also partner with Integral Care to provide wraparound services as they are interacting with individuals that are experiencing homelessness in our watersheds. And finally, the creation of the Homeless Strategy Officer. This was an important step that Council took to really coordinate all the efforts that we're doing as a city within the city, but also with our external stakeholders.
And Mayor and Council, with regard to the Homeless Strategy Officer, that position was funded in the current year budget, which is fiscal year 18-19. And as you may recall, we attempted to recruit that position earlier this year. We were unsuccessful. We refocused our strategy. We hired a national recruiting firm to lead the effort. We closed that position last week. We've got a number of significant applications, and so we anticipate hiring that position very soon. And I can't thank Veronica and her team enough for stepping in an interim role.
So I talked a little bit about this was an organic change as we approached our services as a city. And I think Richard Mendoza, our Public Works Director, said it best here in this room in responding to the contract for the underpasses. And one of his responses was, it's just the right thing to do. And I think we've seen that theme throughout the city with our city employees. It should be noted that these activities have been done intentionally. We have done things like provide mental health training through Integral Care for our employees who are interacting one-on-one with individuals experiencing homelessness. And it's not uncommon to see our employees engage with a human-centered service-oriented approach to dealing with homeless encampments. I just have some visuals of some of the examples of what we have done. Here's a pop-up clinic at the Arch, providing services to individuals. Here's a picture of a watershed encampment cleanup, a before and after look. Some of the work our staff has done. These are the individuals on our Austin Homeless Advisory Council that I had mentioned. So here's a snapshot of funding efforts that we have provided in these multiple areas. And you've seen this slide before. Sarah Hensley, as a part of Sarah Hensley's presentation about a year ago. We are in the process of updating this information, and you will have that as part of your consideration in the upcoming budget discussions. But this gives you a good idea of where our funding is going and how we're addressing the issue of homelessness currently. Also wanted to highlight the number of shelter beds. I've talked a little bit about the Arch. That is the city-owned shelter. It has 165 beds. But as you can see, there's a variety of shelters in our Austin community that offer different numbers of beds for different populations. While it is important that we have shelters that address subpopulations, as we heard, that is considered a best practice. There's also a need at looking at providing shelter for individuals who are homeless and not fitting into one of these subpopulations. But currently, as you can see, we have a total of 822 beds in our Austin area for multiple resources. We are in the process, Austin Public Health is in the process of reprogramming at the Arch. We are midway in that, and we anticipate that the changes will be complete by the end of the year. So we look forward to taking an approach of what's considered a best practice and providing 100% case management to individuals at the Arch, as well as providing increased wages to employees and training as well, and increased training as well. So I'd mentioned there was 30 resolutions passed by council regarding the area of homelessness. There are 2 in particular that were approved this year that I wanted to respond to at this time. The first one was passed in January, and it was regarding the need for an immediate shelter. And you have a summary of exactly how to look at that shelter space on the continuum pathway to housing, not a pathway to homelessness, and also some of the considerations that we were asked to include. And you heard from the the NEHC, the National Alliance to End Homelessness, a couple of weeks ago about what best practices are in looking at a shelter. But just to recap, first of all, we stress that if we build a shelter, if we provide shelter space, it should not be seen as a permanent place for an individual to reside. Instead, it should be an inflow and with an exit plan to housing. We do see that case management and wraparound services are important to provide to all shelter guests. We do recognize that smaller shelters are seen as a best practice. This allows services to be tailored to the individual's needs. We see the importance of providing space for storage at shelters. We know that individuals who are experiencing homelessness have quite a bit of belongings, and their belongings are extremely important to them. So we want to make sure a shelter provides that storage space as well. And we also noted that including space for animals is also important. An individual who's homeless, who may have a pet, a dog most likely, that's not only their best friend, but also it's security for them as well, and it's important to provide a safe place for their pets. We want to see a shelter where there's medical and mental health services, either on-site or nearby. A shelter where there's access to public transportation. Would like to look at a location that's in proximity to individuals experiencing homelessness. We want to make sure this is a low barrier shelter. So this is a shelter where individuals feel welcome and are able to reside in with low barriers. And we also want to make sure the shelter provides access to all individuals regardless of background. So looking at next steps in response to this resolution. We have been collaborating to identify both city-owned and privately owned property that meet these criteria of what would be considered a best practice. We've given consideration to existing structures, temporary structures, or new structures. We do have a discussion of a potential site, as you're aware, in executive session to follow today. We recommend that we do provide case management and wraparound services for all shelter guests. And we also encourage the inclusion of rapid rehousing on the onset. The minute that an individual enters a shelter, we should be talking about rapid rehousing. And I've noted some of the programs that we already have, and then some of the contracts that we're managing as a city. But we'd also always encourage there's an increased need in providing this housing stock, or this housing service, excuse me. And we recommend that shelter capacity is set at 100 guests. In considering the funding and management of the shelter, there's a few options of what we could, funding opportunities that we could look to purchase the shelter, the land, and the necessary costs associated. We have the Waller Creek Tax Increment Reinvestment Zone. This is funds that are accessible. They are not accessible until the debt is repaid. So we do have that time constraint to consider, and we're working on what that time constraint would look like in terms of timing. We have the potential use of $7.5 million identified in CDBG funds. If this goes through, it would be available on October 1. So there's a little bit of a timing concern, or not concern, but we need to be aware of that timing as well. And then the final option would be the issuance of CO bonds. In regards to management of the shelter, we recommend initiating a solicitation process to look at a service provider to manage our shelter. As a part of that, we would start outreach immediately to let service providers know that this is coming, and get some feedback on what they would like to see in that relationship with the city. And we're estimating that funding for this contract would be about $2.5 million, and it would need to be built into the fiscal year 2020 budget and then beyond that as well. The next resolution that I wanted to respond to was the resolution passed in April regarding the Salvation Army Rathgaber and the Downtown Social Service Center. And this asked staff to look at identifying funding not only for the Rathgaber Center, which the Salvation Army has built and is short funds to open the doors at full capacity, but also to look at case management of individuals at the downtown Salvation Army shelter. So to give you an overview of the Rathgaber Center, this is a shelter that is focused on families. The benefit of this shelter is the Salvation Army would be able to move families from their downtown location to their Rathgaber location. In exchange, the downtown location would be open to individuals as opposed to families. This is a benefit because it frees up 55 beds downtown for individuals that are experiencing homelessness. It also gets families out of downtown and into the Rathgaber Center. The goal is to provide 100% case management services. Again, we've done a bit of a broken record, but we do see this as a best practice when we're looking at sheltering. So what I would recommend is we look at $1 million contribution, one-time contribution. About half of that would go towards the cost of the case management downtown, and the remainder towards the Rathgaber Center. We realize that this doesn't fully fill the gap of Rathgaber. However, we know that the Salvation Army is working to raise money as well. I believe they have about $1 million in pledges at this point to fill their gap. And we're hoping that if the city makes a commitment towards that, that'll encourage other individuals in the community to help meet that gap for them. Next steps, I've mentioned the responses to 2 resolutions, but I want to emphasize that we see that these are 2 solutions to a complex issue. Homelessness is a very complex issue, and it's going to require multiple solutions. Some of the efforts that I would like to see this office continue looking at: consideration of a location or locations for a day resource center. As you are aware, this part of the arch will be removed as we go towards 100% case management. I know Austin Public Health is working towards where can we provide those services in other areas in our community. We have a need for navigation centers, a place where people can go and help find the resources that they need. I mentioned storage space locations on site at a shelter. I also think this is a need around the community. So we need places where people can just put their stuff with confidence and not worry about it. And then again, continuing that priority of a housing continuum. We need to continue to address the need of affordable housing stock in our community. We will continue to evaluate both existing and new funding structures because we realize that this is multiple solutions does have an expense to it. And we're also continuing the exploration of a mechanism to optimize philanthropic opportunities. We hear that there's an interest in this community to help give to this effort. We recognize that this is not the city of Austin alone, and we want to find an opportunity for individuals, for companies, for social service providers, whoever is interested in helping us reach a solution to provide those solutions. I would mention that all of these recommendations, it's urged that they are geographically dispersed throughout our city. They should not be centered in one location, and I think you heard that from NEH as well. And then I wanted to note that we're collaborating with the Equity Office. When we're looking at individuals who experience homelessness, there's the number of people of color who are homeless is at a greater percentage than our population as a city and our demographics as a city. We're aware of that. We've had initial conversations with the Equity Office, but because of that, we see that it's important to have the Equity Office involved as we proceed as an office. That concludes my presentation. I'm happy to answer any questions.
Flanagan, Jimmy.
When you are exploring the philanthropic opportunities, you listed a number of groups that have expressed interest. I would make sure to include other government jurisdictions on that list.
I meant to mention that as well. We do see the need to reach out to other government entities as well.
Thank you.
Two questions related to funding. It may also be helpful to reach out to Home Aid, which I think you've been connected to. Home Aid is a relatively recent group in the city that is builders and building trades, and they provide pro bono assistance with building things out. So I don't know if that'll be helpful for a shelter that I hope that we will approve moving forward with. So I just wanted to make sure that was on your radar screen. And then the last question I have, and I apologize, I haven't had a chance to ask you guys this. So I'm sure it's something that you've considered. But we have $250 million in housing bonds, and I know that some of those, certainly not, I mean, it goes for all kinds of things, but I had thought that those bonds were available for homeless shelter. You've identified other sources that may turn out to be great sources so that we wouldn't need to use the housing bonds. But I'm not certain. My question really is why are those housing bonds not listed as a potential source of dollars? Did you guys rule them out or something, or did you consider that? Or
And I see Rosie Truelove joining me here. That's a good point that should have been mentioned in the presentation.
Okay.
Some of those housing bonds, some were identified for homelessness, and I'm going to turn it over to Rosie Truelove to continue.
Good morning, Rosie Truelove, Director of Neighborhood Housing and Community Development. Our $250 million of affordable housing bonds are available to help with the permanent supportive housing or continuum of care housing aspect of the need to house our homeless population, not necessarily the construction of a shelter itself.
is that because? And I'm not saying that we shouldn't be doing that. I'm just asking why. I mean, that's not in what we voted on, right? That's just more in the what you guys have looked at for where the important need is. Is that what's going on?
Well, that's how it was anticipated as we were
Okay.
developing the scoring criteria for rental housing and ownership housing development assistance. And I believe it was not laid out specifically in the contract with the voters that council approved.
Okay.
So we've been taking the approach of utilizing our funds from the bonds
Yes.
to help with permanent supportive housing. Knowing and realizing right now that we have the opportunity to be able to direct about $7.5 million of community development block grants
Okay.
towards a one-time shelter or land acquisition for a shelter or rehab of a building for a shelter.
Okay, that makes sense to me. So, and the other question I had was about the bonds, the rapid rehousing funds. Are those? Because those are not bricks and mortar, right? So that are they contemplated in the bond?
No, they are not.
Okay.
That would be more along the services aspect.
Okay.
And that's kind of the thing to remember with the housing funds, CDBG and general obligation bonds, is they really need to be exclusively used for sticks and bricks, for
Okay.
construction, capital construction of physical things.
Okay.
And even if we were funding, say, a multifamily affordable housing development, our dollars only go towards the actual units. So if, for example, someone is also constructing a resource center or a daycare or community space, our dollars can't go towards that. They go to the specific units that meet our affordability criteria.
Thank you.
Kathy?
Thank you. Thank you for this presentation and for all of your work on this really critical topic. I continue to be somewhat confused about the different pockets of funding and how we can use them. And my main concern is that we're using our most restrictive funds and for the most restrictive purposes, and that we're retaining our more flexible funds for more flexible purposes. And I know that's a concern you share too. Unfortunately, my iPad just died, so I can't pull up the conversations that we've been having back and forth about how to fund some of these different needs. And so to kind of step back a little bit, can you help us understand what would be, I didn't understand the dialogue we just had about the bond funding. So the bond funding has to be used for brick and mortar projects. And what I thought I understood from your response, Director Truelove, is that the bond funding could only be used for shelter for individuals who would be eligible for permanent supportive housing. But it's still the shelter piece of that, not the services.
Correct. So think of it more along the lines of what we've done with Housing First Oak Springs, rather than so individual units, single room occupancy developments that we've seen through the years. Not necessarily a homeless shelter along the lines of the Arch or what we're talking about with some of the recommendations that Ms. Brisenia is bringing forward.
Okay, that helps me understand that conversation. But can you re-answer the question that Councilmember Kitchen asked? Was it in our contract to voters that we not use that money for shelter, or is that just about how we've prioritized it as a city as those applications, as we move through the application process?
So I will want to go back, and I'll do that right now and confirm. As I'm recalling how we laid out how the housing bonds were going to be used, we did spell out some things, and we did not spell out expending the housing bonds on a homeless shelter. We envisioned utilizing them for the longer-term housing solution, and so my recollection is that we did not include shelter space as part of the affordable housing bonds, and I will confirm that as quickly as I can.
Sure.
But that's how. So then, in our scoring criteria for how we deploy our bond funds, that's laid out in the scoring criteria as far as allocating points and extra consideration for folks that are providing what we call continuum of care units. That will accept folks off of the continuum care list that's maintained by ECHO.
When you say we didn't do that in our bond, are you talking about in our language that we presented to
Correct.
the voters? Okay.
Correct.
And I guess that's probably a better choice anyway, because there are some funds that can only be used, or that we think are likely or able to be used for shelter than for the kind of housing you're describing.
Correct.
And one of those, and I'm a little bit unclear about where we landed in terms of the Waller Creek TIF funding. That also has to be used for bricks and mortar projects. It can certainly be used for shelter. It was less unclear about whether we could use it for transitional housing or for individual units. And I don't know, I think I have an answer, a partial answer to that in one of the Q&As, but I don't, because that answer has changed a bit over time, it'd be good to just get clear on whether that TIF money can be used for individual units or housing that is not shelter.
And I was also looking for that response. Oh, it's been handed to me. It was magic. So it looks like it can be. So the response is, in general, the city can use the pay-as-you-go model cash funding to set aside a portion of TIR's revenues on an annual basis for homeless shelters, transitional housing for homeless people, permanent supportive housing for homeless people, or affordable housing projects.
And there's a piece of that can also be used for, there's a part of it that can also be used for operations and maintenance, as I recall. That's a much smaller portion of the. So I think maybe instead of trying to have this conversation, what I think, because we have this conversation, we come back to it, and there's a lot at play here. If it would be helpful, I can kind of put all my questions together and do it as a Q&A attached to this agenda. But I think it would be helpful to have one kind of memo that talks about the different pots of funding and where they're flexible and where they're not flexible. CDBG, I think, is a conversation that the three of us have been having on email about whether general CDBG dollars could be used to purchase vouchers for hotel rooms, for example, for individuals who we want to house. We want to have a safe place that very night.
And I can speak to that if you want.
Great.
So the question is, can CDBG funds be used for something like purchase of vouchers? And they could. However, it goes against our public service dollar allocation. And so for any given grant year that we get CDBG funds, we have 15% that we can spend on what we call public services. And what those are spent on right now are things like childcare, senior services, mental health services. Our Austin Tenants Council contract is also considered to fall into the public services. And so if we wanted to utilize funds for that, we would have to make a determination on to not utilize, because we do have, it's a hard 15% cap.
Yeah.
And so we have that all programmed out already.
So it doesn't count as housing. So again, I think this is all, because I think we pepper the staff with lots of questions and some of them repetitive. If we could just kind of gather all of this in one place so that we're not kind of looking back at emails or the Waller Creek TIF Q&A or whatnot, just to have a really clear picture of that.
And I share that. That's a really great idea, putting it in one memo, and so we'll work on that.
Great. And if it's helpful, I'll, again, commit to providing some questions that I know we've been asking.
Absolutely.
And that we've gotten answered, but so that all of it can be in one spot.
And we do agree with your approach of looking at making sure that we're aware of the constraints and using the most restrictive funding for the appropriate solutions and saving the most flexible funding.
Great. And so, I see the downtown density bonus program. We did a resolution that made that available for services, for example, not just bricks and mortar. And so I hope that we're using that for services primarily. The Affordable Housing Trust Fund is another one that we've said can be services and bricks and mortar. So I hope we're not using that for bricks and mortar projects. And that leads me to the question about the Salvation Army shelter. How is that $1 million contemplated to be funded?
We were looking at an amount that we could absorb in this fiscal year, and working with the budget office, that seemed like a good amount to do that. We still had the goal of providing the case management downtown because of the impact to the individuals downtown, and knowing that the funding gap for the O&M of the Rathgaber, there's ongoing fundraising activities. We felt that this was a good contribution that we could give towards the continued efforts.
Where is it? How is it being funded? Through the general fund? Through general fund?
I believe, and I'm not sure if any is in the room.
Okay. Or you can get back to me.
So, Veronica and I have talked about the $1 million recommendation for the Salvation Army. It would either be the general fund, or since she's talking about it being a one-time contribution, reserves. As the budget comes together, we're going to have to look at where it fits. And, there's a lot of moving pieces in the budget development process right now, but those would be the two potential sources for addressing that need.
And I appreciate the identification of $1 million. As I recall, and I'm not remembering the exact numbers, but the case services piece of that, I think, was about $400,000. And so I guess I would say I see this as really one of the highest priorities in our budget cycle this year, because it is that shelter is going to be open here very soon. We are, as you've identified, as we've all identified, we have an extreme need for shelter, and we have a beautiful shelter opening up that cannot operate at full capacity. And so I would say I really appreciate the city moving forward and identifying funds to participate in that endeavor. And I agree with you that the Salvation Army is continuing to raise funds and will be successful in that, I hope. And I hope that all of us can continue to amplify that as a need in our different communities that we're a part of, because everywhere I go, I hear people talking about the importance of finding housing for individuals experiencing homelessness, and this is a very concrete way that everyone who's able to can participate in this community in helping raise those really important operating funds so that shelter can be used at full capacity. That being said, I hope that we can look at whether we're able to help further close that gap, especially for this year, knowing that the case services downtown are going to take about half of that amount. And it's really important. I think it's so important that all of our emergency shelters downtown be moving toward this new model of providing case services. We know that that's how we'll help people end their homelessness. And so making sure that the Salvation Army has the funds they need to do that case management is critical. But again, as we're looking toward different solutions for emergency shelter, including the other one that we're going to talk about here today, we have a beautiful shelter opening up that's not going to be able to operate at full capacity. And so I think this should be, again, one of our very highest priorities. So thank you. I'm going to continue to talk about what other funding options we have so that we can continue to help them step up both of those gaps. This is really, as you said, going to help us leverage those beds downtown in ways that are critical, and also just do something that's very long overdue of getting those children out of our downtown location. So thank you for all your work on it.
Thanks. I'm trying to remember the sequence of events, and maybe, Ann, you can help me with this. We started working on the housing-focused shelter this
End
year.
of January is when we passed it.
So we wouldn't have had this on our list of items to include in the bonds because we hadn't been talking about it. And where I'm going with this is I think that if we had known that this was going to be an initiative, that we might very well have included language on the bonds that would have been sufficiently flexible that we could have considered this. And that is one of my concerns when we do a contract with the voters. On the one hand, it provides predictability, but it also ties our hands when we can't see that far into the future and we need to make adjustments. So this is a really good example of how that can work against us. So let me then just ask this question, maybe Ed, you can answer it. If we had known that we would have this initiative, and if we had known that we needed the flexibility to be able to fund it, do you think that this kind of shelter would have fit within the confines of the statute regarding to bonds? For example, I know that operations and maintenance generally is not allowed with bonds, but this kind of temporary shelter, could we, if we had known about it, could we have managed to fit it in under the guidelines of bonding?
I think just in general for bonding, when you talk about a temporary shelter, I think it depends on the specifics of it. We wouldn't want to issue 20-year bonds, and I don't know that for a shelter that might only have a 5 or 10-year useful life. If it's something that's going to be more of a permanent structure, then issuing bonds for that would make a lot more sense.
And if I could add with respect to the general obligation bonds, that's something that we would really want to potentially seek guidance from law on. I know the requirements with respect to how we can utilize bonds for affordable housing is something that we very tightly monitor and keep close check with our bond counsel to make sure we're not running afoul of what the AG might have said or says. So it might be something that we would want to get law to weigh in on for just respect to using general obligation bonds for.
Spencer, what do you think? Could that be a piece that we add to the, like kind of the history that Kathy has suggested or requested for what we have flexibility on and what's restricted? Could we also maybe ask our bond counsel for additional input?
Well, Councilmember, we'll certainly try to incorporate a lot of the themes of the discussion today into that memo that would talk about the uses and flexibility of the funding that we would have for these services. So,
thank you.
So, actually, I'll mention the bonds issue first, and then get to my just one question for Ms. Persenio, which is on the bonds issue. It sounds like there is sufficient funding in other buckets to get shelter on the ground, but I do want to lift up just during our first approval of projects for those housing bonds. That project Transitions is a project, as we know, that I thought was in D4, but it's actually on the D7 side of the line, that is 100% helping folks that were experiencing homelessness, formerly homeless individuals. And I anticipate and expect that in our next round of housing projects that we approve from the housing bonds, I hope that we'll have multiple projects that have continuum of care / permanent supportive housing units as part of that package. So I just I don't think that this is anybody's intention, but I don't want folks taking away that the housing bonds weren't heavily supported by the folks that are working on homeless services and aren't addressing that need, because the ones that we just did, one of the key projects did that. And on the shelter side, because it's not rental or ownership, that is why these other buckets could potentially be used to address that. And I think that's less for the council and more for folks watching, to make sure that we know that those housing bonds are addressing where people go when they come out of shelter. We need somewhere for them to go, and that's what the bonds can do that other sources of funds aren't as capable of doing. But now back to Ms. Persenio. Thank you for the presentation. It's really impactful to see how much work and effort has been expended by every department and by this council and by councils for years on addressing the issue. One thing that I took away from the national expertise we had last work session and from your presentation is just how important it is for us to make sure that if we have more shelter beds, that we have enough funding associated with them, that people are going through shelter rather than to it and then staying there. Mm-hmm. And to me, I'm very supportive of and hear the need for us to have more shelter beds. But I just want to make sure that I'm understanding that it is our priority from your office and from the manager's office that if we're going to add shelter beds, that we aren't going to make the same mistakes of not adequately funding the case management and rapid rehousing, and then actually just spreading our money so thin that we're getting people stuck in shelter and then leaving people on the streets rather than using them for what they are intended for. And again, I just want to ask that question and hear a yes, just because that because we're getting from all these presentations that that's the mistake we've made in the past, and I just want to make sure that by continuing to support the staff and continuing to support the resolutions and the process, that we all are under the understanding that we're not going to do that.
You are correct. We see, as we move forward, any shelter space that we build, we see the utmost importance that we fully fund it. That we do see this as a pathway to housing and certainly not an end place for an individual to reside.
Well, I'll continue to be supportive of those efforts with that understanding that if it seems like we're going to buy more beds than we can serve with dollars, or get out of step in that way, that somebody will raise their hand on the staff side, because on the council side we can't know that because we aren't the people that are going in there programming the services, but we just need the staff and the manager to be able to raise their hand and say, this is why we can't go to 150, or this is why we have to only do 70, whatever it is.
Yeah.
We just have to we need y'all to be the backstop on that, because I think there's so much intention to help that we want to add as many beds in PSH as we can, but if we add too many beds and you guys can't adequately see a plan to serve them, then we need your help tempering that, because we all want the same thing, but we want to push to get as much done as we can, but y'all have to let us know when we're going to a place where we can no longer fund what we're trying to get done. So thank you.
Thank you. I look forward to this memo that details more of the financials. In the presentation for the shelter funding, you mentioned certificates of obligations, and I'm just wondering if you could speak a little bit to the circumstances when we can use certificates of obligation and when we can't here, because to the extent that it's a health emergency, it seems like it might be a tool that we could use in this case.
So certificates of obligation are just a form of non-voter approved debt allowed for in state law. They would typically be of 20 plus years in duration to fund capital facilities. State law does prohibit their use for economic development, and it explicitly defines affordable housing as economic development. Then you get into some gray area of where does transitional housing and things like that become affordable housing versus emergency shelter. And so that's where I think sometimes it's a matter of getting the specifics of the project, working with bond counsel to determine if that project could be eligible for certificates of obligation. Affordable housing is a definite no. I would say emergency shelter would be a definite yes, but then you've got all this gray area where we would really need to understand the specifics.
Is there anything in the legislation that just passed with the revenue caps that prevents us from using COs?
No.
Okay.
There was no changes to our ability to issue or use COs, and those are all part of the debt portion of the tax rate, which was not capped at 3.5%. Council does have financial policies that also constrain your use of certificates of obligation. They essentially say that your priority is to use voter-approved debt, but in certain circumstances you will use certificates of obligation, those circumstances being the need is of an urgent matter, it was unanticipated, or it's in the city's economic best interest to do so. So a lot of times in real estate transactions, you will see us come forward with certificates of obligation, because obviously if there's an economic opportunity for the city, if it's a good opportunity for the city to do that real estate transaction, well, we can't wait 5 years for the next bond election, or even 6 months for the next bond election, and still be able to work that real estate transaction. But yeah, that's your financial policies related to COs.
Well, I'm looking forward then to our executive session on the real estate. I don't have the details of that, but it sounds like that a lot of the conditions that you mentioned apply in this particular case. That doesn't get us the services, obviously, that need to be provided. One other thing that you don't mention on there is the Housing Trust Fund. Is that another source of fund for services and shelter?
I think that's going to be addressed in our memo. That will be a follow-up to Councilmember Tovo's request.
Okay, thank you.
I also want to join thanking staff for doing what they're doing. Real anxious to get the staff member on board. So if the application process closed out last week, do we have an ETA for when you think we might be onboarding somebody?
I anticipate that, well, right now the national recruiter that we're using is going through all the applications that were received. I anticipate that we can close out this position within another month.
Okay, that'd be great. I'm not one thing that I think is a really big asset in this community is that we have an entire community that seems to be focused on this issue. There is broader consensus, I think, on dealing with this issue than any other issue that exists. I mean, we talk about mobility, we talk about affordability. Those are broad things and probably impact this issue as well generally. But the homelessness challenge, I think, is huge in our community, and it is in so many ways bringing this community together. Unlike some other communities where the debate on their challenges have deteriorated into demonizing people and really folks that are trying to do the same thing really angry and upset at each other, and it seems to be exacerbating challenges and creating problems. I think that one of the assets we have in this community is we have a community that's aligned, and I think we should try really hard to preserve that because I think that's one of our fundamental strengths. At the same time, I think we have a community that is really, really confused. And they're confused because they don't understand why they're seeing more tents now. They're confused because the issue, the challenge seems to be growing anecdotally to them almost exponentially. We know that not to be the case. We know that it's the census showed an increase of 100 people year to year. But there are a lot of people that feel the increase is much larger than that. In part probably because it's the people that are here are more visible now than they were in the past. And certainly there's a larger physical presence when somebody is building a tent under an overpass than sleeping on a bedroll. So it's something that's more visible. We know that we were up about 4%. We know that the national average was up 5%, I think, and we know that cities nearby like Dallas were up 9% in that same period of time. We're doing a lot, and I really appreciate the kind of the path you took us down on the activity that we are doing, both by ourselves and with partners in the community, because part of the confusion I think that exists in the community is a lack of understanding that we're actually doing something. People want to know that they and for them their government is actually doing something. And I think that people need to be able to see that. There's also questions about the efficacy of what we're doing. Are what we're doing really working when the community still sees the challenge? So I think that we have to not only look at what we're doing, but we have to look at the perception of what we're doing and not doing. And I think the perception is really important because that's what's keeping us together as a community and focused on this and moving forward. So I appreciate this presentation. I'm going to hold off asking the questions that I want to ask you at this point with respect to some of the resolutions that are coming up this week until we've had a chance to go into executive session. But when we come out of executive session, I have questions that I want to ask you about some of the ordinances that are happening. In the presentation that you raised, you point out that we're up 142% over the last 5 years. Which is certainly a really large number. You can also say we're down over the last 9 years. And I think that those two numbers are both equally true, but paint a very different rhetorical position. I'm concerned about a headline that says homelessness up 142% over the last 5 years. I am also equally concerned about a headline that says we have reduced homelessness over the last 9 years. Both statements are true. But they point out the difficulty associated with the challenge that we have in the community. So I just point out that as we have folks here and media here that both of those numbers are true. I hope that as we get the team in, we start looking at kind of new and innovative ideas. And we can talk about some of these in terms of the other resolutions. Should our downtown Austin Community Court be a 24/7 facility? I mean, is there a way to divert people kind of in the way that we did in the sobriety center and be more active in those kinds of innovative solutions that you don't hear a lot of people trying? But I know that that's going to be developed as part of the broader program. I just want to make sure that we're looking at those kinds of things. In looking at how we're spending the dollars, one thing we put a lot more money on in the budget last year was the mental health teams as we stepped up and took over that program. That's not mentioned in here. Does that help at all? Does that intersect with the population of people experiencing homelessness?
Yes, there's several contracts that we have in dealing with the mental health aspect. There is one through the Downtown Austin Community Court that I believe is at 1.14 million. So there is funding in that regard too, and we will update those numbers for you as we move forward.
Okay, because I think that there might be programs that we're spending money on that deals with this, especially in the mental health arena from what we did last time, that I think we should highlight as well, because it's efforts directed toward this challenge as well. I really appreciate and join with the request with the memo that really talks about all the funding streams and then the size of those. The Waller Creek Tax Increment Finance Zone, I think there was a $30 million potential capability associated with that, but we can't access that yet. You're going to talk about in that memo what the timing or what we need to be able to access that as a potential source, what has to happen. In addition to the other things that should be part of that list, the Housing Trust Fund and the other programs we have. I know that people have mentioned the 2018 bond. There were some questions about other possible places we should be taking a look at. I think you need to add to that list the TPID that the council unanimously asked staff to take a look at and start pursuing so that we see what's necessary and the timing associated with that, to see if the council was inclined how quickly we could turn on that spigot to start getting money. I also know that the DAA and the Chamber are now organizing a real direct philanthropic effort with the faith community to start picking up some of the load. I think we need to make sure that we're facilitating that and elevating that as much as we possibly can. I'm supportive of the Salvation Army effort as well. I concur that case management is the key component. I concur with what Greg indicated. I need to better understand the nature of the one-time funding of that. Just because as we go into the budget process, I need to understand if that's really one-time funding or if it's not, and how we're building that into the process. I think as you go through the budget, Manager, we know that based on what the legislature just did, we're 50 some odd $50 million upside down with our existing budget. And here, just sitting in this conversation, we've talked about increasing spending by a tenth of that just on the projects we've just talked about here. I really think that as you go through the budget, we're going to have to really seriously test the concept we had when we did the strategic planning, which was to really do strategic planning, deciding what's most important, and then making sure we move funding to the things that are most important, which means moving funding out of a lot of things that people really like and are really good and are really valuable. But at this point in time, they just don't rise to that level. Because of the budget conversation with respect to the things that we're talking about and making sure we can staff is just real important. Jimmy, Ann, Kathy, Allison. We'll work back through the group.
I just wanted to very quickly
Go ahead.
double down on what the mayor said about perception. I'm already seeing false narratives being put onto social media right now in the middle of this conversation. And this is really more me talking to the media. There are already blog posts being put out that cite falsehoods about the homelessness problem. Those falsehoods are not linked to source material. They are not vetted. And when you look at who the writers are and you look up the organizations that are paying their bills, you find that they're deep conservative think tanks funding pseudoscience. As a community, we have to be smarter about what we read and where the information is coming from. I see posts from the Police Association on a routine basis that are misrepresenting the facts around homelessness. And we have to be careful about how we talk about this problem if we're going to solve it. And I think my colleagues have done great on this issue, and you've had a lot of leadership on homelessness issue, and I want to thank you for that. But we really need to make sure that the public narrative is being pushed back, because what's happening right now is a complete misinformation campaign that I believe is intended directly to undermine government. That is where it's coming from. And you can't just repeat and share blog posts with suspicious authors that have no source material or no academic backing. That's not just happening on homelessness. It's happening on a lot of issues. A lot of issues that are in Austin, a lot of issues that are happening nationally. And that type of rhetoric is blending and bleeding its way into the issues that we're addressing right here in the greatest place to live the last 3 years running. So please, as the reporting continues and as the story continues, as the work continues, let's make sure that we're talking about facts, talking about reality, and not allowing misinformation to be funded from outside dark money.
A couple of things. Let me just speak to the perception issue briefly. There are many different parts and aspects of the challenges with homelessness, so I'll just speak to the facts related to shelter and the need for housing-focused shelter. And I use the term housing-focused shelter. That's a shorthand for me to encompass the kinds of things that Councilmember Kassar brought up, and I think others have brought up too. I use the term housing-focused because what that means is the shelter plus the services to move people into permanent housing as soon as possible. So when I say housing-focused shelter, I mean that's one and the same. So the facts with regard to shelter is that we have increased significantly. I consider significantly. That's a judgment call on my part. But I think having over 1,000 people unsheltered, I think it's really important to look at these statistics. We have, the last point in time count was over, I think it was 1,087 to be precise, in Austin and Travis County, was 1,037, if I'm understanding correctly, or 30-something, for unsheltered in the city of Austin. Unsheltered means living on the streets, living in green belts, place that they don't have shelter. That is a bigger number. There is no, it is increasing, and that is a fact. Now, let's talk about the Echo Point in Time count. Echo Point in Time count is where volunteers from all over the city go, and it's a census essentially. I consider it to be an undercount. But it's telling us that we've got at least that many people living on the streets at that particular point in time for the count. So I don't want us to say that. I don't want us to play with numbers and say, compare percentages of this and that and the other. The bottom line is we have more people living on the streets unsheltered, and that's what our hard data shows us. So the other thing I would say is, I agree that there's a lot of education that would be helpful for people in the community. I do that as much as I can when I talk to people that I hear from in my district. And there are a lot of questions that we all have. But I do think that there is one thing that they do understand, and that is that people live on that there is a need for housing. As the National Alliance told us, people are homeless because they don't have a place to live. And people are unsheltered because they don't have a place to live. There's no confusion about that. And I think that that is something that our constituents recognize. So I just want to pull those two facts out of the conversation. I don't think the public is wrong. I don't think the people that are talking to me about the folks living under bridges in their area are wrong or confused when they think in terms of people needing shelter. So with that said, I do recognize that there is a lot of misinformation out there and lack of understanding and stuff. and people want to understand, and so we need to share that. So, so let me just ask the question. My understanding is that what we're talking about today is a recommendation that we do need increased shelter plus services. I'll call it housing-focused shelter. Am I understanding correctly that that is a recommendation from our homeless strategy officer? And I really thank you for stepping up to the plate. I know that you have just dived in, whatever. Anyway, I mean, you have reached out to all the experts. We've had the benefit of talking to the National Alliance as the experts, what they've seen around the country. So my question is, are you pointing out that there is an additional need for housing-focused shelter, and are you recommending that we do what we can to proceed with that?
We do recommend that there's a need for additional shelter, housing focused, absolutely. As I'd mentioned in my presentation, I think that housing focus happens the minute somebody enters that shelter. We need immediately start talking about housing options and knowing that housing requires wraparound services as well.
Okay.
But fully fledged shelter.
Okay. Well, then I would just say that item 49 does three things. It takes the next step towards moving towards additional housing-focused shelter. It asks our staff to proceed with the process that we'll have more conversation in executive session about, and that's a location. To proceed with the process for determining how much it would cost, and I appreciate the estimate of the 2.5, but how much it would cost in terms of who would be a service provider. And it moves forward with the process of identifying funds in the budget, which of course we'll all have to deal with in August when we deal with the budget. I also would like to say that we also need to support the Salvation Army Center, Rathgaber. But I don't see these as either or. When we look at the numbers for additional shelter that's needed, we need them both. And I hope we don't end up suggesting that we need one or the other. No one has said that. I just want to keep saying that over and over again, that we need both. The other thing I think we need to recognize about shelter, and I really appreciate, this is very helpful information to tell us the existing beds that are out there and what their focus is, that I think we need to remember the importance of looking at shelters around the city. We've had a focus on downtown, which is appropriate and necessary, but homeless people don't just live downtown. And so I think it's important that we also, as we look at as we move forward with the housing-focused shelter that we need, that we recognize that we need to provide services for people throughout town and not just downtown. And I think that the shelters that we have on the ground, first off, if you add up the numbers, they don't reach what we need. Many of them are focused on the most vulnerable populations, which is necessary and appropriate. But we also don't have what we need in terms of the 1,000+ that are living on the streets right now. So I just want to encourage us to think about the Salvation Army opportunity. It's an opportunity for us to help a community organization get over the line. But that doesn't address the housing-focused shelter that we need in the community. So we need to be thinking about moving forward with both. So,
Kathy.
So I agree that we need them both. I think the question is whether we can fund them both. And I'm not privy to the dollar amount that you just suggested. I don't know if that's a conversation that we're about to have in executive session, the $2.5 million, or if that was in yours. Was that for the expense, the bricks and mortar expense, or was that for the operations as well?
That's an estimated amount for the operations, an estimated annual amount for the operations of a potential shelter. So, and I apologize, I should have numbered the slides, but if you look at the response to the first resolution, the third slide in that series references the shelter funding and management slide, and management of a shelter. We're suggesting that for a shelter that shelters 100 individuals, we're looking at about $2.5 million annually.
This would be for a new one.
Correct.
So I think that we need to just take a real solid look. Councilmember Kitchen, I agree with you that we need both. But if we But here's what I see. We would be spending $2.5 million to run it, plus the capital expenses, to run a shelter that would serve 100 people. We need to do the cost-benefit analysis of how many individuals we could shelter if we provided more funding for the Salvation Army shelter. Now, granted, we're talking about different populations of individuals, but I think that cost-benefit analysis is important. As I talked about before, it looks like we're providing maybe $500,000 to the Rathgaber Center. That will not close their what I understood to be more like a $4 million gap. So we have, again, shelter space that won't be fully utilized. At the same time, we're putting significant funds into creating a new. So help us understand this question. You know, a lot of the individuals who are experiencing homelessness and are unsheltered are individuals and wouldn't necessarily be going to the Rathgaber Center. On the other hand, you know, that the downtown shelter, that frees up rooms in the downtown shelter. So we need to understand what our investment gets us in terms of housing in these different areas. You know, especially since, I mean, the one is a pretty costly price tag.
And I'll just note, council member, that will be a very important conversation that will happen during the budget process, and we'll make sure that the data is there to be able to ensure that council has the appropriate information to weigh some of those factors, because these are going to be critical decisions as we're moving forward with the budget, but that will come in a few months.
So I may have misunderstood too then. I thought that, when we talked about identifying funding within the general fund for this year for shelter, I thought the Salvation Army money was actually coming out of fiscal year 19.
We are recommending the Salvation Army funding to come from this fiscal year, but I think the city manager is referring to additional funding
For the previous years.
Yes.
Okay, but we believe that we could do some funding.
This fiscal
Rather,
year.
you've identified some funding that would be rather immediate.
And if I could expand on that, I know you know this, council member, but the interest in the Salvation Army is to have that shelter open and running before the school year,
Right.
and the importance of having families start schools in the location that they reside.
Absolutely, which makes it really critical that we identify kind of as much funding as we can to help that. And I echo the mayor's comment about that being ongoing funding. Two quick questions, just smaller ones. The library program, I'm glad to see that we have dedicated staff. I know through the years there have also been classes, college students or graduate students who have done programming or have provided some social work assistance at our central library. Are those efforts still ongoing?
I am not sure, but I will get that answer to you. And I'm not sure if somebody from the library is in the audience, but if not, we will respond to you as soon as we.
Yeah, that would be great. I know we had that conversation when we talked about adding staff, that we wanted to amplify the kinds of existing programming, not replace that good work that we were getting through partnerships with local universities. And then just mention that now that we have taken on, I think we talked about this during the conversation we had about TxDOT, about our absorbing the costs of cleanups on TxDOT land. We talked about the need to provide trash cans and recycling bins in those areas. Now that we're taking on the responsibility of cleaning, we also will have permission from TxDOT to service those areas in a way that will keep them more sanitary. So in driving around town, I'm not seeing that happening. So
We are working on that. As we've brought Public Works into the area of cleanups, we are starting to meet as a city, the different departments that are providing cleanups in different areas in our city. But that is one thing that we have identified as a need. Trash cans, also potentially looking at a purple bag pilot program like what has been done in our watershed, expanding that to our underpass
Great.
areas as well. So that's an ongoing discussion. We absolutely see the importance.
that's great. Are there any impediments to doing it quickly? I mean, do we have the permission we need? Do we have to seek permission from TxDOT? Or I guess what's the impediment to just putting out some garbage cans and having ARR start to service those?
Public Works is currently in discussions with TxDOT right now about that to ensure that there's no impediments, but I'm not aware of any on the onset. We are looking, as we provide those services, we're looking at starting at a pilot level so we can understand if there's any increased funding that we need to bring back to council, but we believe that we can start within our existing resources, a pilot where we identify at least 10 sites where we start.
That would be great. I regard that too as something that would really be of big benefit especially if it can be done rather quickly.
And Councilmember Tova, I did get confirmation that the social work, the students are still providing those opportunities in our libraries as well, our
That's
central
great.
library as well.
In the central library? Super, thank you.
Allison.
So in highlighting homelessness as a top strategic priority and through the leadership of Councilmember Tovo and Mayor Adler and Councilmember Kitchen, I think we're at a point where we really have a sense of the things that need to be done. And what we're struggling with is trying to make sure that we have funding to do that. We're not alone as a city in trying to tackle this. We're fortunate in Austin to have a very strong bench of nonprofits that are in here working with us. There are other governments that are working with us. And I think it's really important that the public understand this, that compared to where we were 2 years ago, I think as a community, as a whole, we have a better sense of the levers that we need to pull and where those investments need to be making. And that's a role when we're trying to solve a problem that government can play well, particularly when we're convening and collaborating with folks. In this case, we are in need of more resources. And the community has an opportunity to further join with us in solving this problem. And I want to invite the community to join us in doing that and to recognize that we as a city do know what needs to be done, but we need some financial help, particularly in light of the revenue cap process. To that end, just in today's presentation, there was one project in particular that very clearly, we've discussed it in the past, but for the public with the Ratgaber Center and the Salvation Army, where we know exactly how much needs to be invested in order to provide exactly how many more beds that we can provide, that does things. So can you speak to how somebody who wanted to make an investment in homelessness might be able to help fill that gap for the Ratgaber Center with Salvation Army?
Absolutely. I did not include contact information to the Salvation Army, excuse me, for the Salvation Army for those opportunities, but we can certainly get that word out to the public and help communicate that. I know that they have a strong fundraising arm that's working towards filling that gap, so we can make sure that that information is accessible to the public.
Yeah, we're a very wealthy city. We don't have the traditions of philanthropy of Houston or Dallas. And my hope is that with respect to the homelessness issue, now that we are at a better point of having our plans and really knowing what investments need to be made and which ones will be most impactful, that we can have some broader engagement on that. My second question has to do with the faith leaders. I know that in my district there are another number of faith communities that are actively working with folks experiencing homelessness. And there was a mention of a new program or some new efforts with respect to coordinating with the faith leaders who were not always included in the city's discussions before Ms. Hensley was working on it, as I understand it. So can you speak a little bit to what those efforts are?
Yes, and thank you for bringing that up. So we do see that as an important, as we're working with not only the nonprofit community, we want to make sure that we're working with the faith-based community as well. So, and looking at the creation of this office, I do see one of the roles is to coordinate what's already existing. I'm hearing in many ways all the great things that our faith-based community is doing in this community, and it's little things from peanut butter and chili sandwiches to providing shelter space. And so I do see it instrumental as this office progresses that we have the ability to try to coordinate those efforts, to let the public know, communicate those opportunities as well. I'm hearing that, if we could have a better sense of how those efforts are streamlined, that would be helpful, so that we don't have 4 churches show up at the Arch on the same day, having a better, having the ability to coordinate those efforts. So the faith-based community is a very crucial part of addressing the issue of homelessness, and we want to make sure that we're assisting with that as we move forward.
Thank you. Thank you for your work, and look forward to the new staff member being in place. And finally, I wanted to ask Mr. Cronk if you could speak a little bit more to some of the issues raised by Councilmember Tovo and how you would like us to be thinking about the budget elements and how we're supposed to weigh these things in the absence of having that clear cost-benefit analysis on the agenda this week, and some real choices before us, an absence of knowledge at this point, understandably, because the revenue caps were just passed, how would you like us to be thinking about this process as we weigh the pros and cons? Even if we all agree we need to do both, how do we think about those decisions before us?
Sure. Certainly appreciate that comment, and I'm looking forward to the conversation that we'll have this summer. And I'm just paused by saying that, our departments are still getting back to us, and so we're a little bit early in the process to bring some of these choices back to council. So if you could allow me a few more weeks, but I will be teeing up some of those discussions to be able to have both in the public setting so our community can weigh in, but to ensure that we have enough data and information so those decisions are being weighed effectively. But we're just getting the information back from departments to see what kind of constraints and opportunities we have within our existing budget.
Jimmy and then Ann.
So thank you, Councilmember Alter, for bringing up the opportunity with faith communities. That's something that I'm working on in my district. I've had 3 different church leaders come to me with different versions of how they want to help or how they might help. And so we're going to start convening kind of as a pilot idea some of the churches that are geographically constrained in kind of a little area that are already finding people experiencing homelessness coming to their doors. Even St. Thomas More, which is a Catholic church on 620, there's not even a sidewalk, much less a bus line. And they still find people coming to their door looking for food and looking for help. St. Thomas More is an interesting example because St. Thomas More used to have a home on their property where people experiencing homelessness could stay while they got back on their feet. They no longer do that because the sprinkler system inside the building was broken and the city would no longer allow people to occupy the building, and the church couldn't raise the money to fix the sprinklers. So we're piecing these things together. I have churches in my district that provide preschool service. I have some that provide mental health counseling. And I think there's an interesting way to tie all these groups together that can tap into some philanthropy, but not just looking to churches or faith communities as places to show up and deliver a meal, but an opportunity for people, for organizations and communities that own land, that could actually be the communities that surround folks that are in transition. So we're working on stuff for that in my district that hopefully becomes a template.
Ann.
I just want to speak briefly. I think that Councilmember Flanagan and Alter, thank y'all for pointing to this. It is a community-wide issue. It's the kind of thing I've said before. I think it's all hands on deck from a community perspective. To come together to come up with solutions, and so I hope we remain focused on that system that we need, and we move forward with that. I don't want to assume that we can't create the system that we need, and I also don't want to assume or start talking from the standpoint of, well, we can't do this or that because we don't have enough dollars. I think we need to understand what it is that we need. We need to understand the city's role in moving forward. It's an urgent need. We need to move quickly. And then we need to partner with the kinds of folks that people have mentioned. And we need to consider the dollars that we have available from a city perspective to contribute to that. I don't want to get, I personally think that as a community, we need to step up to the plate and make this happen, and the city has a leadership role in doing so. So, and to me, that's not, we need to wait. That's not we can't do it because we don't have enough money. It's not we have to choose this over that. We need to create the system that we need, and for lots and lots of reasons, all the way from the humanity of it to the importance for our community. We've seen what other cities have experienced. If we don't get ahead of these issues, we don't want to go down that road. So anyway, I just wanted to I really wanted to say I appreciate all the brainstorming that's been raised here.
Someone, go ahead, Pio.
Yeah. And I also want to thank y'all for this, for your presentation and effort that you have put in there. It's very sad that we're having to ask for permission to the state to clean up their underpasses. It's very disappointing. You would think that since we're investing our taxpayers' money cleaning up the underbridge, that the land that they own, that they have fully control over, and they wouldn't be coming down here to us and saying thank you and making a presentation and recognizing our effort to help the state, their land. It's really frustrating. We take care of their roads, and we have to ask them to do the repairs on their streets like South Congress, south of Otorp, like Lamar, north of 183, that we have to get their permission to fix up their roads with our money, and they still, the way they respond to us, we have reached out and tried to work with them, and we still haven't asked for permission for that. That is a sad state of the state, from the way they are treating Austin. But I really appreciate the citizens of Austin that have stood up and said that we are going to invest our tax money to address these type of issues that we're having. And it's going to be very hard because of the cap that they were imposed on Austin, and we're trying to address these issues and make Austin into a great city. And we're constantly frustrated to see. And I believe there's some people just dumping their trash underneath these underpass, because you clean it up and the next day there's still you see a truckload of trash underneath Cesar Chavez with bites and all kinds of different. I mean, it's just frustrating. But I really want to thank the city staff for the work they have done. Thank you.
Okay, so I'm going to recommend now that we take a recess. We go into executive session to discuss 2 items, and I'll break for that, and then we can come back out. I want to just conclude with, again, I just want to emphasize that our community is so united and directed to trying to do something about this challenge. It is clearly the number one priority as I go around the community, what people want to talk about. It is what the council's identified as its first priority in its strategic planning process. I think it is important that we get the numbers out for people to understand the numbers, because it's a complex issue. And I don't think that it's playing with numbers to talk about the percentages that we have on the sheets. I think it's important for people to know and understand. And I do think that people are confused. I was on TV this morning and on a radio station, and people are asking what they can do to help. Should they be bringing sandwiches and clothes somewhere? Should they be raising money to help provide support services? Should they be making donations to Salvation Army or to the city or to ECHO? People are asking, what can they do to help? And I think that everything that we're looking at, the conversation about the ordinances that we're going to have after the executive session, people are confused, but they so want to do something to help. And I think we should take that as a strength and use that to be a community that actually is able to meet this challenge when so many communities are having difficulty.